Kid, don't leave me here. The voice was so weak that it almost disappeared beneath the roar of the storm. For a moment, Elijah Brooks thought he had imagined it. Rain hammered the sidewalk in silver sheets, bouncing off parked cars and overflowing gutters. The sky above Charlotte, North Carolina, looked like a dark ocean turned upside down, and the wind pushed cold water through every layer of clothing he wore. Elijah tightened his grip on the canvas newspaper bag hanging from his shoulder and kept walking. He only had 3 deliveries left. 3 more houses. 3 more chances to earn the few dollars that would help his grandmother buy the medication she needed before the end of the week. Then he heard the voice again. Please, Elijah stopped. The neighborhood street was nearly empty. Porch lights glowed behind rain-streaked windows. Tree branches bent and swayed under the force of the storm. Most people were safely inside their homes, wrapped in blankets, watching the weather on television. Nobody should have been outside tonight. Nobody except him. He turned slowly. About 30 feet away, near a bus stop shelter, stood an elderly man. His gray coat was soaked completely through. Water dripped from the brim of his hat. One hand rested against the metal bench as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. Even from a distance, Elijah could see the man was shivering. The old man tried to take another step. His shoes slipped slightly on the wet pavement. Elijah's stomach tightened. He checked the time on the cracked face of his watch. If he stopped now, he would miss his final route. His manager had already warned him twice this month about late deliveries. One more mistake, and he could lose the job. The thought of disappointing his grandmother hurt almost as much as the icy rain soaking through his sneakers. She never complained, even when her arthritis made it painful to move around their small trailer home. She always smiled and told him everything would work out somehow. But Elijah knew better. Medicine cost money. Groceries cost money. The electric bill cost money. Hope alone couldn't keep the lights on. The old man coughed. The sound carried through the wind. Elijah looked toward the final row of houses waiting for their newspapers. Then he looked back at the stranger. Something about the man's face stopped him. It wasn't fear. It wasn't desperation. It was loneliness. The kind of loneliness Elijah recognized immediately. The kind that came when the world kept moving and nobody stopped to notice you were struggling. A black SUV rushed past, spraying water across the curb. The driver never slowed down. A second car followed moments later. Same thing. Nobody stopped. Nobody rolled down a window. Nobody asked if the old man needed help. Elijah exhaled slowly. Then he removed his thin jacket and walked through the rain toward the stranger. Sir, he called out. Where do you live? The old man looked up. His tired eyes widened slightly. For the first time all night, a small spark of relief appeared on his face. And neither of them realized that this simple decision was about to change both of their lives forever. The old man blinked rainwater from his eyes and stared at Elijah as if he could not quite believe someone had stopped. For several seconds, neither of them moved. The storm roared around them, rattling the bus stop shelter and sending leaves skidding across the flooded street. Then the man managed a faint smile. Arthur, he said quietly. My name is Arthur. Elijah nodded. I am Elijah. Do you know your address, sir? Arthur hesitated before reaching into his coat pocket with trembling fingers. He pulled out a small folded piece of paper that had somehow survived the rain. Elijah carefully unfolded it beneath the shelter. An address was written in neat handwriting. It was nearly 2 miles away. Elijah looked from the paper to the elderly man. That is a long walk in this weather. Arthur glanced toward the dark road and gave a tired shrug. I suppose it is. For a moment Elijah considered calling for help, but Arthur shook his head before he could even suggest it. My phone died hours ago. I must have missed my ride. I thought I could make it on my own. Another gust of wind swept through the street. Arthur pulled his coat tighter, but it offered little protection. Elijah could see how exhausted he was. Without another word, he shifted his newspaper bag to his other shoulder and motioned down the sidewalk. Come on. We should get moving. Arthur studied the boy for a second. You are giving up your evening to help a stranger. Elijah shrugged. My grandmother says everybody is a stranger until somebody decides to be kind. The old man chuckled softly. It was the first warm sound either of them had heard all night. Together they started walking. Water splashed around their shoes with every step. Streetlights reflected off the flooded pavement like broken strips of gold. Elijah stayed close enough to steady Arthur whenever the older man lost his balance. As they walked, Arthur asked questions. Not the kind adults usually asked. He did not ask about grades or sports or what Elijah wanted to be when he grew up. Instead, he asked things like, "What makes you happy?" and "What is the best thing that happened to you this year?" Elijah thought about those questions longer than expected. Most people never asked him things like that. He finally told Arthur about his grandmother, about how she made pancakes every Sunday, even when money was tight. He talked about delivering newspapers before school and helping neighbors carry groceries when they needed it. Arthur listened carefully, as if every answer mattered. After nearly a mile, they passed a convenience store glowing brightly through the rain. Elijah stopped and reached into his pocket. He counted a few crumpled bills. The money was supposed to help buy medicine later in the week. Still, he walked inside and returned with a bottle of water and a small sandwich. Arthur looked surprised. "You did not have to do that." Elijah handed him the food anyway. "You look like you have not eaten in a while." Arthur stared at the sandwich before accepting it. For a brief moment his eyes seemed unusually emotional. Then he nodded and quietly said, "Thank you, son." They continued through the storm, unaware that somewhere far across the city, several people were desperately searching for a missing man whose disappearance had already set important events into motion. The rain showed no sign of stopping. It poured from the sky with relentless force, turning intersections into shallow rivers and forcing most people indoors long before nightfall. Yet Elijah and Arthur continued forward one careful step at a time. The old man had finished the sandwich slowly, almost thoughtfully, and some color had returned to his face. Even so, his movements remained unsteady. Every few minutes Elijah glanced over to make sure he was still doing all right. "You should not be worrying about me," Arthur said after noticing the boy's concerned expression. "You are the one standing out here in soaked shoes." Elijah looked down at his sneakers. Water squished beneath every step. He smiled anyway. "I have had worse." Arthur laughed softly. "Something tells me that is true." They crossed another block. The neighborhood gradually began to change. Small houses gave way to larger homes. Well-kept lawns appeared behind decorative fences. Street lights stood taller here, casting warm pools of light onto the rain-dark pavement. Elijah noticed the difference immediately. He had delivered newspapers all over the city and knew these streets belonged to a very different world than the one he and his grandmother lived in. Arthur seemed to notice his reaction. "Do you ever wish you lived somewhere else?" he asked. Elijah thought for a moment. "Sometimes. But my grandmother says a good home is about who is inside it, not how much it costs." Arthur grew quiet. His gaze drifted toward the glowing windows of a nearby mansion. "Your grandmother sounds wise." "She is." Elijah smiled proudly. "She raised me after my parents passed away." Arthur's expression softened. "That could not have been easy." Elijah shook his head. "It was not. But she never let me feel sorry for myself." The old man nodded slowly, as though filing every word away. Several blocks later, they reached a long private road lined with towering oak trees. At the far end stood enormous iron gates nearly 12 feet high. Beyond them, through the curtain of rain, Elijah could make out the silhouette of a sprawling estate. Lights glowed from dozens of windows. The place looked less like a house and more like something from a movie. Elijah stopped walking. "This is your address." Arthur followed his gaze and smiled faintly. "Looks like it." Before Elijah could respond, headlights suddenly appeared from the opposite direction. One vehicle, then another, then a third. Dark SUVs rolled toward the gates and stopped abruptly. Doors opened. Several men stepped out wearing dark suits despite the storm. Their expressions were tense. One of them spotted Arthur immediately. Relief flooded his face. "Sir," he shouted as he hurried forward. "We have been looking everywhere for you." The others quickly followed. For a brief second Elijah thought they would be grateful. Instead, suspicious eyes shifted toward him. One man stepped between Elijah and Arthur. Another looked at the soaked newspaper bag hanging from the boy's shoulder. "Who is this?" he asked sharply. Elijah froze. The warmth of the journey vanished instantly. Arthur opened his mouth to answer, but the men were already exchanging worried glances. None of them seemed interested in hearing the full story. And standing beneath the cold rain outside the massive gates, Elijah suddenly felt smaller than he had all night. Arthur immediately stepped forward. "Enough," he said, his voice calm but firm. The effect was instant. The men fell silent. Rain drummed against the black SUVs while water streamed down their coats, yet none of them seemed willing to interrupt him. Arthur turned toward Elijah. "This young man helped me when nobody else would." The nearest man lowered his head slightly. Sir, we were concerned for your safety. And you should be, Arthur replied. But concern is not an excuse to forget basic courtesy. An uncomfortable silence settled over the group. Elijah shifted the newspaper bag on his shoulder. Suddenly, he felt very out of place, standing among luxury vehicles, expensive watches, and people who looked like they belonged in boardrooms instead of rainstorms. One of the men finally extended a hand. My apologies, son. We have been searching for Mr. Calloway for hours. Elijah nodded politely, but did not know what to say. He was still trying to understand what was happening. Arthur Calloway clearly was not an ordinary retiree. The size of the estate alone proved that. Then Arthur looked toward the mansion and sighed. You should come inside. You are soaked. Elijah immediately shook his head. I cannot, sir. Arthur seemed surprised. Why not? Elijah glanced at his watch. The cracked glass reflected the estate lights. I still have newspapers to deliver, and my grandmother will be worried if I get home too late. For a moment, nobody spoke. Several of the men exchanged looks. They appeared genuinely stunned. Elijah had just walked nearly 2 miles through a storm, yet he was worried about finishing his route. Arthur's expression softened. You are worried about your responsibilities. Yes, sir. Arthur smiled faintly. That is rare these days. One of the suited men stepped forward holding an umbrella. We can drive you home. Elijah shook his head again. Thank you, but I need to finish my deliveries first. The answer seemed to surprise them even more. Arthur let out a quiet laugh. You remind me of someone I knew many years ago. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a simple business card. Unlike the extravagant surroundings, the card was surprisingly plain. He handed it to Elijah. If you ever need anything, call this number. Elijah accepted it carefully. The card felt strangely heavy in his hand. Before he could read it, another gust of wind swept through the entrance. Arthur glanced at the stormy sky. Promise me you will get home safely. I will, sir. The old man nodded. Good. Then, unexpectedly, he placed a hand on Elijah's shoulder. Thank you for seeing me when nobody else did. Those words stayed with Elijah long after he turned and walked away from the estate. The rain seemed colder now. The road felt longer. Yet something about Arthur's voice lingered in his mind. By the time Elijah finished his final newspaper delivery, it was nearly 10 o'clock. His shoes were soaked through. His fingers were numb from the cold. And tucked safely inside his pocket was the business card he had not yet examined. What Elijah did not know was that inside the brightly lit mansion behind him, Arthur had just entered a private study where several anxious executives were waiting. The moment the door closed, one of them asked a question. Sir, have you decided what to do about the boy? Arthur looked out the rain-covered window toward the distant city lights and answered without hesitation. Yes, find out everything about him. The storm finally began to weaken sometime after midnight. By then Elijah was home, sitting at the small kitchen table while his grandmother warmed a pot of soup on the stove. The trailer creaked softly as rain tapped against the roof. The familiar smell of chicken broth filled the room, washing away some of the cold that had settled into his bones. You are late, his grandmother said, though there was more concern than criticism in her voice. Elijah smiled tiredly. I met someone who needed help. She raised an eyebrow. And knowing you, you helped him. Elijah nodded. As he ate, he told her everything. The bus stop, the walk through the storm, the giant estate, the men in suits, even the business card still tucked inside his pocket. When he handed it to her, she adjusted her reading glasses and studied it carefully. Her expression changed almost immediately. Elijah, she whispered, do you know who Arthur Calloway is? He shook his head. Should I? She stared at him in disbelief. He founded Calloway Industries. His company employs thousands of people across the country. Elijah blinked. That old man. His grandmother nodded slowly. That old man is one of the wealthiest businessmen in the state. The room fell silent. Elijah looked down at the card again. It suddenly felt even stranger than before. Yet despite everything, the image that stayed in his mind was not the mansion or the SUVs. It was Arthur standing alone in the rain, shivering beneath a bus stop roof while the world passed him by. The next morning the storm was gone. Bright sunlight spilled across the neighborhood, making puddles sparkle like scattered glass. Elijah woke before dawn as usual and prepared for school. Life felt normal again. The same worn backpack, the same sneakers, the same worries about bills and medicine. By the time classes ended that afternoon, He had almost convinced himself the previous night had been a strange dream. Then he turned onto his street and stopped walking. Several black luxury sedans were parked outside the trailer park entrance. Neighbors stood on porches whispering. Children pointed from bicycles. Curtains shifted behind windows. Every eye seemed focused on a single place. His home. Elijah's heart began to race. As he moved closer, he saw 3 men in tailored suits standing beside his grandmother on the front steps. They were not smiling. They were not angry either. They simply looked serious, as though they had come to discuss something important. One of them noticed Elijah approaching and immediately straightened his tie. Another opened a leather folder. The third stepped forward. "Elijah Brooks?" he asked. Elijah nodded cautiously. The man smiled politely. "My name is Richard Sterling. I work for Mr. Arthur Calloway." The entire street seemed to hold its breath. Richard glanced at the folder in his hands before looking directly into Elijah's eyes. "Mr. Calloway has asked us to bring you to his estate immediately. There is something he wants you to hear in person." For several seconds, Elijah simply stood there. The afternoon sun felt strangely distant as he stared at the 3 men in suits. Around him, neighbors whispered from porches and open windows. A little boy stopped riding his bicycle just to watch. Even his grandmother looked as though she was trying to understand how a routine school day had suddenly become something out of a movie. Richard Sterling offered a reassuring smile. "You are not in trouble, son." Elijah swallowed. "Then why does Mr. Calloway want to see me?" Richard glanced briefly at the other men before answering. "That is a conversation he wishes to have personally." The response only deepened the mystery. Elijah looked toward his grandmother. She gave him a small nod. "Go hear what the man has to say." 20 minutes later, Elijah found himself sitting in the back seat of a luxury sedan unlike anything he had ever experienced. The leather seats were softer than his mattress at home. The cabin was so quiet that he could barely hear the traffic outside. As the city passed by through tinted windows, he kept wondering why a man like Arthur Calloway would care about a boy from a trailer park. Across town, the estate appeared even larger in daylight. Massive stone columns framed the entrance. Carefully trimmed hedges stretched across acres of land. A fountain sparkled beneath the afternoon sun. Elijah felt underdressed the moment he stepped out of the car. Richard led him through enormous front doors into a grand hallway filled with polished wood, marble floors, and sunlight pouring through towering windows. Yet despite all the luxury, something caught Elijah's attention immediately. Several framed photographs lined the walls. In nearly every picture, Arthur stood beside factory workers, teachers, nurses, and ordinary families. There were very few photographs of politicians or celebrities. It felt unusual, almost personal. A housekeeper guided Elijah into a quiet sunroom overlooking a private garden. Birds moved among flower beds outside. Water trickled softly from a stone fountain. The peaceful atmosphere felt worlds away from the stormy night they had shared. Then the door opened. Arthur entered wearing a simple sweater instead of the soaked coat Elijah remembered. His face brightened the moment he saw him. "Elijah." "Hello, sir." Arthur smiled warmly and motioned toward a chair near the window. "Please sit." Once they were seated, Arthur studied him for a moment. Not in the way wealthy people often appeared to study others. Not with judgment. Not with curiosity. More like gratitude. Finally he spoke. "Do you know how many people passed me that night without stopping?" Elijah shook his head. Arthur looked out toward the garden. 37. The answer stunned him. Arthur continued quietly. "My security team reviewed every camera they could find. 37 people saw an old man alone in a storm. 37 people kept going." Sunlight reflected across the glass between them. The room fell silent. Then Arthur looked back at Elijah. Only one person stopped. Elijah lowered his eyes for a moment, unsure how to respond. To him, stopping had never felt extraordinary. It had simply felt right. Arthur seemed to understand what he was thinking. A gentle smile crossed his face. "That is exactly why I wanted to meet with you again," he said. Sunlight drifted across the room, illuminating dust particles floating through the quiet air. Outside, a breeze moved through the garden, carrying the scent of fresh flowers through a slightly open window. Arthur folded his hands together. "Most people believe character reveals itself during important moments. I disagree. I think character reveals itself when nobody is watching." Elijah listened carefully. The old man continued. "You did not know who I was. You did not expect a reward. In fact, helping me cost you something. It cost you time. It cost you comfort. It may have even cost you money. Elijah thought about the missed deliveries and the medicine his grandmother still needed. Arthur noticed the brief shadow that crossed the boy's face. Your grandmother's prescriptions, he said quietly. Elijah looked up in surprise. Arthur nodded. Richard told me about your situation. I asked because I wanted to understand who you are, not because I wanted to judge you. The room fell silent again. Then Arthur stood and walked toward a large bookshelf. From one of the shelves, he retrieved an old photograph in a silver frame. He handed it to Elijah. The picture showed a young man standing beside a small delivery bicycle. His clothes were worn. His smile was bright. That was me, Arthur said. Elijah stared at the photograph. You? Arthur laughed softly. Hard to believe, isn't it? Elijah nodded honestly. Arthur returned to his chair. When I was 14, my mother worked 2 jobs. We struggled to pay bills. I delivered groceries after school. Some nights I wondered whether life would ever get easier. Elijah studied the photograph again. For the first time, the distance between the billionaire and the boy seemed smaller. What changed? He asked. Arthur looked toward the garden. Someone believed in me before I believed in myself. The answer lingered in the room. Then Arthur reached into a nearby folder and placed several papers on the table between them. Elijah glanced down, but could not immediately understand what he was seeing. Arthur's expression became serious. I spent last night thinking about what happened during that storm. The more I thought about it, the more I realized something. He paused. People spend millions of dollars searching for talent. They spend fortunes hiring consultants to identify future leaders. Yet sometimes the most valuable qualities cannot be measured on a resume. Elijah felt his heartbeat quicken. Arthur slowly pushed the documents closer. What I saw that night was integrity. The words seemed to hang in the air. Then Arthur smiled once more. And I would like to invest in that. Elijah stared at the documents without touching them. The pages looked official, filled with logos, signatures, and language far beyond anything a 13-year-old normally encountered. He glanced up at Arthur, uncertain whether he had heard correctly. Invest in me? Arthur nodded. Yes. Richard Sterling quietly entered the room carrying another folder and placed it beside the first. Then he stepped back, allowing Arthur to continue. The older man leaned forward slightly. I have spent most of my life building companies. People think business is about money. It is not. Money is only a tool. Real success comes from recognizing value before everyone else sees it. Elijah listened carefully. Arthur tapped the documents. These papers establish a scholarship fund in your name. Every educational expense from now through college will be covered. Elijah blinked. For a moment, he thought he had misunderstood. College? Arthur smiled. If that is the path you choose. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Outside, sunlight danced across the fountain in the garden. Somewhere in the distance, a bird landed on the stone edge of the water and remained perfectly still. Elijah looked down at the papers again. Nobody in his family had ever talked seriously about college. Most days he focused on helping his grandmother make it through the month. Thinking years ahead had always felt like a luxury reserved for other people. Arthur seemed to understand exactly what was happening inside the boy's mind. This is not charity, he said gently. I want you to hear that clearly. Elijah looked up. Arthur continued. Charity helps someone survive a difficult moment. Opportunity helps someone build a future. Those words settled deeply into the silence. Richard opened the second folder and slid a single photograph across the table. It showed Elijah's trailer home. Nearby stood his grandmother smiling beside a small flower garden she had built from recycled containers. Elijah frowned slightly. Arthur noticed. My team visited your neighborhood this morning. Richard nodded respectfully. Your neighbors had wonderful things to say about you. Elijah felt embarrassed. I did not do anything special. Arthur laughed softly. That is becoming a pattern. Then Richard handed Arthur another sheet of paper. The older man reviewed it briefly before smiling. Your school principal also spoke highly of you. Elijah shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Praise was never something he knew how to handle. Arthur noticed that too. You see, he said, integrity leaves footprints. People remember it, even when the person showing it does not. The afternoon light grew warmer as the conversation continued. Then Arthur reached into his pocket and removed a small silver key attached to a leather keychain. He placed it gently on the table. Elijah looked confused. What is that? Arthur's eyes sparkled with quiet amusement. That is not for today. He leaned back slightly. It belongs to something I intend to show you very soon. Elijah stared at the key. The mystery only deepened. Arthur folded his hands and smiled. Because what I have offered so far is only the beginning. Elijah's eyes remained fixed on the small silver key resting on the table. It seemed impossibly ordinary compared to everything that had happened during the past 24 hours. Arthur allowed the silence to linger for a moment before standing and motioning toward the garden doors. Come with me. Together they stepped outside into the warm afternoon sunlight. The storm felt like a distant memory now. Water droplets still clung to flower petals, catching the light like tiny crystals. Birds moved between the trees, and the air carried the clean scent that only comes after heavy rain. Arthur led Elijah down a winding stone path toward a small building at the edge of the property. Unlike the mansion, it was simple, modest, almost forgotten among the larger structures. Arthur handed him the key. Go ahead. Elijah hesitated before unlocking the door. The hinges opened quietly. Inside was a small library. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling. Hundreds of books filled the room. A large desk sat beside a sunlit window. Framed photographs covered one wall. Teachers, students, graduates, families. Elijah looked around in confusion. Arthur smiled. This was my first scholarship center. Elijah turned toward him. Arthur continued. 40 years ago, someone invested in me. When I succeeded, I promised myself I would do the same for others. He gestured toward the photographs. Every person on that wall received an opportunity. Many became doctors, engineers, teachers, and business owners. But that was never the goal. Elijah listened carefully. What was the goal? Arthur's eyes moved across the photographs. To remind people that their circumstances do not define their future. The words settled deeply into Elijah's heart. For most of his life, poverty had felt permanent, like a wall standing between him and every dream he never allowed himself to imagine. Yet standing there, surrounded by stories of people who had started with very little, something inside him began to change. Arthur placed a hand gently on his shoulder. The scholarship is yours if you choose to accept it. The mentorship is yours. The opportunities are yours. But the most important thing I hope you never lose is the reason this all began. Elijah immediately thought back to the bus stop. The rain, the cold, the lonely old man everyone else had ignored. Arthur smiled as if he knew exactly where the boy's thoughts had gone. Kindness is not weakness, Elijah. It is one of the rarest forms of strength. Later that evening, a black sedan pulled into the trailer park. Neighbors watched quietly as Elijah stepped out carrying nothing more than the same backpack he had left with. His grandmother waited on the porch. The moment she saw him, she smiled. Elijah walked up the steps and wrapped his arms around her. Neither spoke for several seconds. They simply stood there beneath the golden light of sunset. Across the neighborhood, children laughed in the distance. A gentle breeze moved through the trees. Life looked exactly the same as it had the day before. Yet everything was different. As darkness slowly settled over the horizon, Elijah glanced toward the sky where the last traces of the storm had completely disappeared. The road ahead remained uncertain. There would still be challenges. There would still be hard days. But now there was also hope. And all of it had started with a simple choice made on a rainy night when nobody was watching. Not because he expected a reward. Not because he knew who Arthur Calloway was. But because he chose kindness when it would have been easier to walk away. And in the quiet that followed, that choice became the beginning of a new future.